Hi, I'm the son who left 8 years ago. Thought I was giving space. Thought I was doing the right thing. But when I came back, my parents were sitting in the dark eating canned soup, too scared to ask for help, because asking meant going through him. And him? My brother. He looked like he'd seen a ghost when he saw me at the door. That's when I realized this wasn't just distance. This was a takeover. They didn't just forget me. They erased me. The late afternoon light slanted through the trees as I turned down the street I hadn't driven on in 8 years. Same cracked sidewalks, same mailboxes leaning slightly left or right like time had nudged them gently. The houses stood mostly unchanged. Some paint a little more faded. A few porches had sagged with age. But the bones of the place were the same. I slowed the rental car to a crawl, windows down. The warm Texas air thick with the smell of cut grass and something faintly sweet I couldn't place. My parents' house came into view. The old sycamore still shaded the front yard, though its leaves had browned early this year. I pulled to a stop at the curb, left the engine running for a second, staring at the porch where I used to leave my muddy sneakers. A familiar tightness crept up my chest, somewhere between anticipation and dread. I hadn't told anyone I was coming. No phone call. No email. Not even a guess who's back in Houston? Post. That wasn't my style. I wanted to see it raw, how things really were, not how people acted when they knew you were watching. I stepped out, shut the car door quietly. My suitcase stayed in the trunk. On the porch sat a man I almost didn't recognize. It was my father. He was slumped in a faded lawn chair. Not the rocker he always used, but one of those cheap folding kinds, the kind you'd see at a garage sale for $5. His clothes didn't match. Khaki slacks with a navy flannel shirt half tucked in, the sleeves unevenly rolled. He didn't look up when I approached, just stared into the yard like he was waiting for something that never came. He wasn't wearing his watch. That small detail hit me harder than I expected. Dad never went anywhere without his watch. Retirement didn't change that. Church, grocery run, even just watering the lawn, he always had it on. Now, nothing. Just a pale indent where the strap used to be. The porch chair was turned slightly away from the front door. Not angled for comfort. Angled like he didn't want to be inside. Or maybe he wasn't allowed to be. Dad? I said, barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. Just blinked slowly, then tilted his head down, subtle, almost imperceptible. A signal? A warning? I moved up the steps, one creaking under my weight. The screen door was cracked open. Inside, voices, laughter, glasses clinking. I recognized my brother's voice immediately. Mark always had that rehearsed charm, half businessman, half politician. Yeah, we let them stay here, he was saying casually. I mean, what else were we gonna do? Can't just throw them out, right? More laughter. A woman, muttered something about being charitable. Another voice chuckled. You're too nice, Mark. I froze in the doorway. Not because of what he said, though that landed like a slap, but because of how easily he said it. Like it wasn't the first time. Like it was a bit he'd done before. And no one corrected him. No one said, hey, they're your parents. No one laughed uncomfortably. They just accepted it. I looked over at my father again. He hadn't moved. It hit me then, this wasn't new. This wasn't an offhand comment at a dinner party. This was routine, practiced. Inside, I could see part of the living room. My mother sat on the edge of the armchair, not her usual spot on the couch. Her hands were folded tight, eyes fixed on a spot just past the coffee table. She didn't laugh, didn't flinch, but she didn't speak either. They'd learned silence. I didn't move. I wanted to burst in. Wanted to say, what the hell did you just say? Wanted to grab Mark by the collar and pull every smug tooth from his mouth. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I watched. I observed. I remembered who I was. The youngest. The one they forgot to call. The one who sent money home every month from Shanghai and barely got a thank you. The one who was always too sensitive or too serious. No, I wasn't going to be the guy who made a scene in his own childhood home. Not yet. Not while there were eyes that didn't know who I was watching. I shifted my weight and stepped quietly inside. The hardwood floor creaked under my foot. and that was all it took. Mark looked up from his wine glass. His smile froze. The color drained from his face like someone had flipped a switch. He didn't speak. No one did. The room went quiet the second my brother saw me. No one said my name, but everyone knew exactly who I was. I stood there, a foot past the doorway, and it was like someone had pressed mute on the whole room. Mark still held his wine glass, halfway to his mouth, but he didn't drink. A woman in a red dress who'd been laughing seconds before now looked anywhere but at me. A man on the sofa cleared his throat like he had popcorn stuck. Eyes darted. Then, like some unspoken cue, they all turned away, as if I were a door someone forgot to close. The conversations resumed. Laughter returned, softer this time, but not for me. My brother took his time. He placed his glass on the table beside him, adjusted his shirt cuffs like he was hosting a fundraiser, not a dinner at our parents' house. Then finally, with that curated smile he always wore in public, he spoke. "Well, look who finally showed up." His voice was too smooth, like he'd rehearsed it in the mirror. One of the guests leaned in. "You know him?" Mark chuckled. Yeah, that's my brother. He's been around. Helps out sometimes when he's not off chasing some business deal in China or wherever." Someone let out a polite laugh. "Oh, I thought you only had one sibling." Mark shrugged. "He's been gone a while." And just like that, I was reintroduced as a footnote. A helping hand. Not the youngest son. Not the one who paid for Dad's medication last year when Mark didn't return a single call. Not the one who sent flowers every birthday even when no one thanked me. I didn't say a word. Just took a slow step forward and scanned the room. No one asked where I'd been. No one stood to hug me. My mother glanced up, briefly, then looked back down at the untouched glass of tea in front of her. Dad still hadn't moved from the porch. The lie had landed. Neatly. Smoothly. Like butter on toast. Mark had been telling it for a while. I noticed the shift. The way some of the guests glanced at me like I was a distant cousin crashing a party. One woman whispered something to her husband, and he gave a nod I knew too well. "That's the one they warned us about." I felt it. Not anger, not yet. But that numb sort of disbelief when your mind hasn't caught up to your body. Mark walked over, offered a handshake like we were colleagues who'd bumped into each other at a networking event. "Glad you could make it," he said, voice low. "Didn't know you were in town." "I didn't know I needed to RSVP to my parents' house," I replied, just as quietly. He smiled, tighter this time. "Well, you know how things have changed." That line. I held on to it, like a thread I might need to pull later. I glanced around the room, trying to understand the new rules. That's when I saw it, on the wall behind the fireplace. A large framed photo, professionally taken. Everyone smiling in coordinated outfits. Except me. I wasn't in it. Mom, Dad, Mark, his wife and their kids. Even Aunt Lorraine from Chicago. But no sign of me. Not a shadow. Not a joke about me being late and photoshopped in later. Just nothing. A guest noticed me staring. "Oh, that's such a beautiful family photo," she said sweetly. "Mark said your parents moved in a few years ago. That must have been taken right after." Mark didn't correct her. "Yeah," he said. "That was a good day." The woman turned to me. "You must be one of the cousins?" Mark stepped in. "Distant cousin, yeah. From out west." A beat passed. I looked at my mother. Her face didn't move, but her hand clenched the napkin in her lap just a little tighter. My father still sat outside. From where I stood, I could just see the curve of his shoulder through the open screen door. He hadn't been invited in. That's when it clicked. This wasn't a moment. It was a system. Mark had built something here, a world where he got to define truth, rewrite the past, crop people out of pictures. And my parents? They weren't agreeing with it. They were surviving it. I walked past the buffet table, reached for a drink just to have something in my hand. Not that I needed it, but standing there empty-handed made me feel even more out of place. Mark's wife offered me a tight-lipped smile from across the room, the kind that said, "Don't make this a scene." So I didn't. I let it all sink in. The erasure, the silence, the fear. Mom caught my eye again, just for a second. Enough for me to see something behind the stillness. She was afraid, not ashamed, not confused. Afraid, not of me, of what would happen if I said anything. This wasn't the time to fight. Not yet. This game was older than I thought. And if I wanted to undo it, I needed to know all the rules. I nodded politely at the next guest who looked my way. Took a sip of watered-down punch. Let them forget I was ever part of this house. Near the piano, someone laughed too loudly at a story Mark was telling. And then Mom just about burned the roast again, like she always does, right? He said. She still burns it? One guest joked. She tries. He laughed. We mostly keep them out of the kitchen these days. Another round of chuckles. A younger man, maybe one of Mark's work buddies, leaned toward him. You're doing a good thing, you know, taking them in like this. Not everyone would. Mark gave a humble shrug. They're old. They needed a place. What was I gonna do? The man turned to me. It's cool that you help too. I mean, it's like having to adopt your own parents, right? No one corrected him. Mark didn't even blink. My mother didn't move. My father was still outside. That was when I understood this wasn't new. It was routine. Once something becomes routine, it stops being an accident. After that guest's offhand comment about taking in our parents, I stepped away from the main room. I needed air, but not from outside. I needed space away from Mark's voice, away from the performance he'd perfected for the crowd. The hallway was dim, lit only by a standing lamp near the staircase, and quiet enough that I could hear the murmur of voices fading behind me. I moved slowly, letting my hand drag lightly along the wall. The paint color had changed. Pale gray now. The photos that used to hang there, my third-grade Halloween costume, our dog Bailey asleep on Dad's lap, Mom's old graduation picture, gone. In their place were large generic prints of flowers and muted landscapes. Nothing personal. Nothing real. It was like walking through a house on the market, staged to feel warm, but scrubbed clean of any life that had actually been lived. The deeper I went, the more the space felt unfamiliar. The old bookshelf that used to sag under Dad's engineering manuals and Mom's cookbooks had been replaced by a sleek cabinet with glass doors, showcasing awards I'd never seen before. Mark's real estate plaques, framed magazine clippings, a crystal trophy that read, Top Sales Team 2021. It wasn't just that I wasn't in these new displays. It was that nothing before Mark seemed to exist. I turned into what used to be the den. It still had the same footprint, but it felt colder, thinner. The mismatched recliners Dad and I had repaired together. Gone. The quilt Mom used to throw over the couch in winter. Gone. In their place, beige leather furniture, untouched. A single remote lay neatly on the armrest. No newspapers. No crossword puzzles. No signs anyone actually sat here. I walked slowly around the space. That subtle tightening in my chest returned. Not pain, something else. Like a part of me had been rubbed out of this house with a wet cloth. And then I noticed it. The mantel. Where we used to have a row of family photos in misaligned frames, there were now only 3. Mark shaking hands with a city official, Mark and his wife on a beach vacation, and Mark with his kids standing in front of a Christmas tree. There used to be one photo of the 4 of us. Me, Mark, Mom, and Dad, taken right after I graduated from college. I'd worn a cheap gown and stood stiff as a board, but Mom had cried when she saw it. That photo had been there for years. It was gone now. I moved toward the hallway again, heading for the old study. That room had always been a time capsule, filled with drawers and bins of old letters, report cards, pictures no one bothered to sort. I pushed open the door gently. The room was still there, but the clutter was gone. File cabinets now. A locked drawer where the old cardboard boxes had once sat open. A new desk. A new chair. The faint smell of lemon furniture polish, like someone was trying hard to keep something preserved or concealed. One framed picture sat on the desk. I picked it up. At first glance, it looked familiar. The backyard, a barbecue, plastic chairs. My parents sitting side by side. Mark behind them with his hand on Dad's shoulder. But something was off. There was a gap in the picture. A space between Mom and Dad that didn't make sense. Like someone had been there but wasn't anymore. Then I saw it. A faint blur where my hand had once rested on the chair. The grass in that spot didn't match the rest of the lawn. And the shadow. The angle was wrong. Whoever edited it had cleaned it well, but not enough to fool someone who'd stood there before. They hadn't forgotten me. They'd removed me. I sat down slowly, still holding the photo. The weight of it wasn't in the frame, it was in what it represented. You can't crop out a mistake. You can only crop out something that used to matter. That was the moment the grief turned into something sharper. It wasn't just that Mark had rewritten the story. It was that he had the time, the energy, the audacity to do it right, methodically, carefully, and without resistance. Because there was no one left to resist. I thought back to the guests, their easy acceptance of Mark's version. The way they nodded when he spoke, as if he'd earned every word. I realized then they weren't seeing the truth. They were seeing a curated museum of the family he'd built. One where I never existed. I left the study and walked quietly toward the kitchen. Mom was there, rinsing a glass under the tap. Her back was to me. She hadn't heard me come in. "I remember when you used to keep the peanut butter in that top cabinet," I said gently, more to see if she'd turn than anything else. She paused. Her shoulders stiffened. She set the glass down carefully, then turned, but not all the way. Just enough to acknowledge me without stepping into the moment. "I don't really eat peanut butter anymore," she said softly. "Right?" I replied. An awkward silence hung in the air between us. Not angry, just fragile. I didn't press. Neither did she. Then I saw Dad, standing just outside the back door, looking up at the sky. It had grown darker now. The porch light buzzed overhead. He wasn't smoking, just holding onto the railing like he needed it to stay upright. Mom noticed me looking. "He likes the air." "I know." We didn't say much more. But in that stillness, something passed between us. Not forgiveness. Not connection. Something else. Understanding. They weren't part of the lie, but they were surviving inside it. I started to walk back toward the hallway when I noticed a door near the laundry room. One that used to be for the old supply closet. Now it was painted white with a newer doorknob. Locked. Before I could think much of it, Mark's voice came from behind me. "That one's off limits." I turned. He smiled like it was nothing. Just storage. Nothing exciting. I didn't respond. Just nodded once and stepped away. But something about his tone shifted. This wasn't just his house now. It was his territory. That was the moment I knew the house no longer belonged to all of us. Ownership, I learned, isn't always written on paper. I stood quietly at the edge of the hallway, my gaze fixed on the closed door I'd seen earlier. The one Mark had casually deemed off-limits. I waited until the last of the guests had filtered out, their polite goodbyes echoing faintly from the front entrance, followed by the soft thud of the door closing behind them. The atmosphere shifted the moment they were gone. It was no longer a house hosting a get-together. It became a place with rules. I stepped forward, my intention subtle, as if I were just stretching my legs. But the second I turned toward the back corridor again, Mark was there, too fast to be coincidence. He wasn't smiling this time. His hand casually gripped the frame of the hallway entrance, his body blocking just enough of the narrow space to make a point without being obvious. "Looking for the bathroom?" he asked, tone light. "No," I replied, "just remembering the layout." "Well, you've been gone a long time," he said. "Things shift." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, they do." There was a pause, long enough for me to wonder if he'd step aside. He didn't. "Hey," he added more casually now. "That part of the house is just storage now. Boxes, paint cans, junk Dad was supposed to haul out. You're not missing anything." It was polite, almost brotherly. But it wasn't a suggestion. I turned away first. I didn't want to, but I also wasn't about to shove my way through and make a scene. Not yet. Not when I didn't even know what I was looking for. Still, I saw the flicker of tension in his jaw. He'd noticed I wasn't just wandering. Later, in the kitchen, Mom was arranging plates with quiet, anxious energy. Stacking, unstacking, wiping things that were already clean. Dad was sitting at the far end of the table, nursing a glass of water, eyes distant. I stood near the counter, my back to the stove, watching. "So," Mark said, sliding into a chair like he owned the place. "You plan to stay long?" I shrugged. "I'm not in a rush." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's fine. It's just, there's kind of a rhythm here now. A flow, you know? Might take a while to adjust." I caught the meaning, loud and clear. Mom flinched ever so slightly at his words, her hands tightening around a dish towel. "Of course," I said evenly. "Wouldn't want to throw off the flow." That earned a glance from him. A warning glance, but still no outright challenge. "Not yet." He changed the subject quickly, asking Dad something about the neighbor's fence. The kind of small talk that fills space when no one wants to touch the real things. But I wasn't interested in fences. I was watching Mark's hands, his subtle glances toward the hallway, the way his fingers tapped the table when conversation veered too close to uncomfortable. Later, I found myself alone with Mom in the laundry room. She was folding a pair of Dad's socks, her eyes not meeting mine. "You look tired," she said, though I didn't. I waited. Silence can be louder than words. Finally, she spoke again, almost in a whisper. "Just don't start anything, okay?" I didn't answer right away. "He said you'd be angry," she added, eyes still down. "But it doesn't help." "What doesn't help?" I asked, even though I knew. "Pushing, asking, stirring up things that have already settled." She sounded rehearsed, like she'd said it before, to herself maybe, or maybe to Dad when he dared to remember things as they really were. "Is that what happened to all the photos?" I asked gently. She folded another sock, slower this time. "It's just easier." "Easier for who?" She didn't answer, and I understood. This wasn't about sides. It was about survival, about making it through the day without consequences. "I'm not here to make things harder," I said. "But I'm not leaving." For the first time, she looked at me fully. Her eyes were tired, worn down, but still, somewhere deep behind them, I saw relief, even if she couldn't say it. Later that night, I passed through the living room again. Mark was collecting the last few wine glasses from the mantel, humming under his breath. I pretended not to notice how his eyes tracked my movement. I paused near the hallway again, not even trying to go down it. I didn't have to. That door, the one he didn't want touched, now had a faint scratch on the lock. New, fresh, as if someone had opened it too quickly, or maybe tried to force it recently. And then I saw it on the side table near the couch. A folder that hadn't been there earlier. Papers inside, barely tucked in. The edge of a document stuck out, white against the dark wood. I stepped toward it casually. Before I could reach it, Mark swept in, almost too casually, and picked it up. "Oh, meant to file this earlier," he said, tucking it under his arm. "Old insurance stuff. Useless, really?" He smiled. And then, without missing a beat, he turned back to the kitchen, whistling like nothing had happened. But I'd seen enough. The way his hand trembled slightly, the edge in his voice, not quite matching the ease of his words. Whatever he didn't want me to see was no longer about pride. It was about leverage. Leverage only matters when someone is afraid of losing something. By the time the last car pulled away from the driveway, the house felt twice as quiet and 3 times heavier. The music was off. The fake smiles and soft laughter that floated through the walls earlier had disappeared like steam off a cooling kettle. What lingered now wasn't just silence. It was what silence tried to hide. Dad moved slowly toward the den, shoulders a little too rounded for a man who used to command the whole backyard with just a rake and a scowl. Mom was already in the kitchen, rinsing glasses she didn't drink from. Mark didn't retreat, he wandered, in and out of rooms. His presence wasn't anxious. It was patrol-like. I sat at the edge of the living room couch, fingers loosely interlaced, elbows on knees. I could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. It was the same one from when we were kids, but even its tick sounded quieter now, like it had learned to keep its opinions to itself. "You still here?" Mark asked, stepping in with a half grin that didn't ask for an answer. "Just collecting old memories." I said. Don't trip over any of him. This place is cleaner than you remember. He was right. Too clean. Sterile. Like a model home pretending to be lived in. But it wasn't the cleanliness that unsettled me. It was what had been swept away. I waited until he disappeared upstairs before I stood and made my way toward the kitchen. Dad was seated near the back door now, nursing a mug of tea he hadn't touched. You okay? I asked. He nodded once. Always. It was a lie so small it didn't even try to disguise itself. I saw the papers, I said gently. Or at least what you've been signing. His eyes flicked to mine, then quickly to the floor. Son, he began, voice rough. You don't have to explain. I'm not trying to explain. I'm asking you, don't dig. Why? He set the cup down without drinking, fingers trembling just enough to be noticed if someone was looking for it. Because the last time I questioned something, your brother locked me out of the bank account for 2 weeks. Told your mother it was a technical issue. He chuckled, a tired, bitter sound. But it wasn't. He was making a point. I sat back against the counter, letting that settle between us. You think he'd actually? I don't think. I know. His voice didn't rise. I know what he's capable of. The weight in his words wasn't from anger. It was from acceptance. That kind of resignation doesn't happen overnight. It gets layered over time like paint on old wood. And eventually you forget what the original color even was. I didn't press him further, but I watched him for another minute before slipping out of the room. I didn't need to hear more. I already felt it in my gut. I wandered down the hallway, letting muscle memory take over. I found myself at the small office where Dad used to keep baseball scorebooks, old tools, and broken clocks he swore he'd fix someday. The door creaked open easily, but the space inside was different now. Tidier, labeled folders in neat piles, printer that looked new, nothing personal, except one drawer was slightly ajar. Inside, tucked beneath a pile of warranty manuals, were 2 medical forms. I didn't pull them out entirely, just enough to scan the header. They were for Dad, but the signature at the bottom wasn't his. It was Mark's, dated just 3 months ago. There was also a notary stamp. I blinked once. Slowly. My heart didn't race. It just thudded with a steadiness that told me I was no longer imagining things. I slid the drawer shut and stepped away. No confrontation yet. Just cataloging. Like building a case in silence. I passed by the living room again, stopping at the hallway mirror. I didn't recognize the reflection, not because of age or wear, but because I looked like someone trying too hard not to react. This is what restraint costs, I thought. It makes you unrecognizable even to yourself. Back in the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed that hadn't belonged to me in over a decade. I stared at the beige walls and the decorative throw pillows that clearly hadn't been picked by either of my parents. I thought about what it would mean to leave, to get in my car, drive off, and pretend I hadn't seen any of this. It would be so easy. Too easy. That's what made it dangerous. I stood and paced once, twice, then paused by the window. Outside, the streetlights buzzed like they always had, casting that familiar orange glow across the yard. But inside this house, the air felt altered, like I was breathing someone else's version of reality. I stepped into the hallway again, quiet as a breath. The light from the kitchen stretched in soft rectangles across the wood floor. Then I heard it. Mark's voice, low, clipped, coming from the den. I didn't walk toward it. I stood still, letting the sound travel. No, we're on track. Yes, I have full access. Everything's in place. They don't question anything. A pause. No, he won't be a problem. He's just looking. Another pause. A longer one this time. Timing is everything. I backed away slowly, careful not to make the floor creak. The voice inside me wasn't angry. It was cold, focused. This wasn't about something that had happened years ago. This wasn't just the residue of old mistakes. This was still happening. And once you know it's still happening, you can't pretend you don't see it. I stood at the kitchen sink, staring at the dark window above it, replaying the sound of Mark's voice from the den. The words themselves didn't matter as much as the tone. Calm, certain, like a man moving pieces on a board he'd been studying for years. I realized then that staying quiet wasn't neutral anymore. It was permission. I dried my hands slowly and turned. Dad was at the table, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on nothing. Mom hovered near the counter, wiping the same spot again and again. The house had settled into that late-night stillness where every sound carries weight. "I need to ask a couple of questions," I said, keeping my voice level. "No accusations, just questions." Dad flinched. Mom froze. Mark entered from the hallway like he'd been waiting for his cue. "Questions about what?" "About the paperwork," I said. "The forms with your name on them. Dad's accounts. Medical stuff." The air tightened. Not a shout. Not a slammed door. Just pressure. Mark smiled, thin and controlled. "I'm helping them. Someone has to. You've been gone a long time." "I saw dates," I replied. "I saw signatures." He leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "You saw pieces, not the whole picture." Mom finally spoke. "Please, it's late." "I'm not here to fight," I said. "I'm trying to understand." "That's the problem," Mark said, voice sharpening. "You don't understand the stress you're causing. Dad doesn't need this. Neither does Mom." Dad lifted his head. "Mark." "No." Mark cut in, not looking at him. "He needs to hear it." He turned to me. "You walk in after 8 years and start poking around, asking questions, stirring things up. Do you have any idea what that does to them?" I nodded once. "I do. That's why I waited." "And yet here we are," he said, "creating confusion." There it was. The word he'd used before. Confusion. A neat way to label truth when it becomes inconvenient. "I'm not confused," I said. "I'm concerned." Mark stepped closer. Not aggressive. Just close enough to make the point. "Your concern is disruptive." Mom's hands trembled. "Please, both of you." Dad stood slowly. "Let's calm down." Mark finally looked at him, eyes cool. "Sit down." Dad hesitated. Then he sat. Something cracked inside me. Not loudly, not all at once. It was the quiet understanding that this wasn't a disagreement between brothers. It was a hierarchy being enforced. Mark turned back to me. "You staying here makes things harder. Doctors don't like stress. Banks don't like uncertainty. People start asking questions." "That's the idea," I said. His smile vanished. "Careful." "Or what?" I asked, still calm. He exhaled through his nose. "Or you make this worse for them. You don't live here. You don't deal with the aftermath." Mom reached for my arm. "Please, let it go. Just for tonight." I looked at her and saw fear. Not of me, but of what would happen if I didn't back down. Fear learned over time. Practiced. "I hear you," I said softly. "But I can't pretend I didn't see what I saw." Mark straightened. "Then maybe you shouldn't be here." The room went still. Dad stared at the floor. Mom's eyes filled, but she said nothing. I felt anger rise, hot and fast, then settle into something colder, clearer. Mark wasn't powerful because he yelled. He was powerful because he'd taught them to be afraid of consequences they couldn't name out loud. "I'm not leaving," I said. "Not tonight." Mark studied me for a long second. Then he nodded, almost approvingly. "Your choice." He moved toward the hallway, then paused. "Just understand this. If you keep digging, things will change. And not in ways you can control." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten directly. He didn't have to. I watched him disappear down the hall, footsteps measured, unhurried. A man who believed he'd already won. I stood there with my parents, the distance between us wider than the room. I knew then that words wouldn't fix this. Explanations wouldn't either. Whatever came next would carry a cost, and everyone in that house knew it. But I also knew something else. Mark wasn't calm because he was confident. He was calm because he was afraid of what I might uncover. And that meant the line I'd crossed wasn't imaginary. Fear doesn't always make people retreat. Sometimes it makes them reckless. I barely slept. The house held its breath all night. Too quiet, too still. I lay on the narrow couch in the den, the ticking wall clock louder than usual, a reminder that time hadn't stopped just because we had. Every creak in the wood, every gust of the sea, felt like someone moving in the dark. By dawn, my body was exhausted, but my mind was clearer than ever. Mark moved differently in the morning. Still polite, still composed, but sharper in tone, tighter in his pacing. He didn't look at me unless he had to, and when he did, his eyes didn't rest. They scanned. I knew that look. That was the face of someone calculating risk, not hiding it. Mom was already in the kitchen, her hands deep in dishwater she'd forgotten to turn warm. Dad sat at the breakfast table, reading the same paragraph on the paper over and over. Their silence wasn't peaceful. It was practiced, and that's when it began. I caught the change in Mark's voice first, talking low into his phone just outside the back door. He wasn't whispering, but it wasn't for the house to hear either. No, he's unstable. He showed up out of nowhere. You should have seen how he talked to Dad. It's putting too much pressure on them, emotionally and financially. A pause. No, I think we need to prepare some documentation, just in case. Yeah. I've already started. He hung up without noticing I'd heard everything. Within an hour, I felt it. The subtle shift from tension to action. The first email came from my cousin Lyle in Austin. Hey man, Mark said something about you being upset. Everything okay with your folks? Then another from Aunt Ruth. I hope you're not making things difficult over there. Your brother's doing the best he can. And then, like clockwork, an unfamiliar number texted me about a wellness check. I stared at the screen. He was rewriting me in real time, turning me into a liability, a disruption, a threat. He knew exactly how to play this. Take the initiative, flip the story, build a paper trail. All while smiling at Mom over scrambled eggs. By the time I stepped back into the living room, Dad looked up with heavy eyes. He opened his mouth, hesitated, and looked down again. Something happen? I asked gently. He shook his head. Nothing new. Just, maybe you should let things settle a bit. Did Mark say something to you? He didn't answer. But he didn't have to. That weight in his voice wasn't new. It was resignation. Fear wrapped in a father's instinct to keep the peace. Dad, if you need help, real help, not just paperwork and signatures, then you have to let me in. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up his coffee. Your brother's not a bad person. I didn't say he was, I replied. But good people do bad things when they're scared of losing control. That landed. He looked away. I spent the rest of the morning watching, listening, moving through the house like I belonged there, because I did. But every hallway, every drawer, every word was a reminder of how much Mark had quietly claimed. That's when I found it. An unfiled envelope on top of a stack in the study. Opened but not processed. It wasn't the document itself, it was the signature. My father's, dated just days after a hospital stay last year. Authorization for Mark to access, manage, and redirect financial decisions. I scanned the rest quickly. The phrasing was clean, legal. But the timing right after a stroke made it predatory. I didn't confront. Not yet. I slid the envelope back exactly where it was. I needed more, and I knew where to look. That afternoon, I walked with Mom to the patio. She moved slower now, her shoulders curled inward like she was bracing for something. I used to come out here every morning, she said, barely above a whisper. Not so much now. I didn't press. Instead, I waited. Finally, she looked at me. He's not all wrong, you know? We are tired. I know, I said. That's why I'm here. But tired isn't the same as helpless. She studied me for a long moment. You always had a way of making things feel simpler than they are. I smiled gently. Not simpler, just clearer. We sat quietly until she reached over and touched my arm. Please don't leave yet. I won't. That night I moved with purpose. I waited until the lights dimmed, until Mark retreated to his room. Then I went back to the study. No rushing, no panic. I took my time, and when I found the folder tucked behind the cabinet, documents, notes, even emails printed out. I knew this was the hole he didn't want anyone to find. Bank transfers, health directives, even communication logs with extended family, suggesting my absence meant incompetence. It was all there. Not illegal, not overtly abusive, but orchestrated. And built on the assumption that no one would ever question it. I slid the folder into a legal envelope and sealed it. By the time I turned off the light and crept down the hallway, I felt the weight shift. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was building something. And I knew the next time Mark saw me, it wouldn't be the same. And I knew the next time Mark saw me, it wouldn't be the same. I didn't sleep that night, but I wasn't restless. I was still, focused. I watched the morning seep through the blinds like it was testing the house for weak spots. The walls felt thinner. Or maybe I was just finally hearing what had always been there. Low voices, tense footsteps, a shift in tone when I entered a room. The truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be undeniable. By 7:30, the coffee pot gurgled in the kitchen, and the smell floated out like a peace offering. I didn't take it. I sat on the edge of the old recliner in the living room, the one Dad used to fall asleep in during football games. Now no one sat in it but me. Mark came in first. Buttoned shirt, phone already in his hand. He was checking something, likely making sure his version of the story stayed ahead of mine. He didn't look at me, but I noticed the smallest flicker in his eyes. He knew. I knew. We both knew something was about to snap. Mom and Dad followed, quiet, deliberate. They sat on the couch like they were waiting for someone else to speak first. There was no sound but the hum of the fridge in the next room and the creak of the ceiling fan overhead. "Good morning," I said, just loud enough to be heard. No edge, no smile. Mark responded without looking up. "Morning." That was all. I let the silence stretch just a beat longer before setting the small folder on the coffee table. I didn't open it, just let it sit there, plain, unassuming, and heavy. He noticed it. Of course he did. Before I could say a word, Mark made his move. "You know," he said, standing a little taller, "I was on the phone with Uncle Ray this morning. Told him you'd been acting off, talking circles, bringing up old things that don't help anyone." He looked at Mom when he said it like she was the one who needed convincing. I stayed quiet. "And I've already contacted Mom and Dad's attorney," he added, "just to make sure we're all protected from misunderstandings." There it was, his final swing, painted like concern, framed like responsibility, but it was pure fear dressed in a suit. "Is that right?" I said softly, finally meeting his eyes. His jaw clenched, but he didn't flinch. I reached forward and opened the folder. First page, a notarized document with Dad's signature, dated after his last hospitalization, the same week he was barely speaking. Second page, a bank statement, withdrawals, transfers, a signature that looked shakier than anything Dad had written in years. Third page, a printed email chain between Mark and an estate planner, discussing contingency transitions without copying either of our parents. No yelling, no accusations. I let each page fall onto the table like cards in a slow game of poker. Mom's hand rose to her mouth. Dad leaned forward, squinting, reading. Mark didn't move. "The original files are backed up," I said, "and I've spoken to someone, not a lawyer yet, but someone who knows what this looks like." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, thick with what couldn't be unsaid. Mark opened his mouth like he wanted to object, but nothing came out. He looked down at the table, then back at me. He wasn't frowning. He was calculating. "You went through private documents," he said finally. "I went through what was left out in the open," I replied. "And what wasn't had a way of finding its way to the surface." He started to speak again, but Mom cut in. Not with words, just a soft gasp, a tremble in her voice. "You told us it was just for convenience," she whispered. "Just to help with the bills." Mark turned to her. "It was. I had to streamline things, Mom. You and Dad, you don't always catch everything. I was just trying to help." Dad was still staring at the papers. He didn't say a word, but his fingers were trembling against the armrest. The room shifted. Not loudly, not with drama, but I felt it, the tilt, the weight redistribution. For the first time since I walked into that house, I wasn't the one being managed. I was being heard. Even the distant cousin Mark had invited, Jeff, who had been sitting in the hallway pretending to scroll his phone, stood up and slowly walked in. He looked at the documents, then at me, then at Mark. "I think you should let someone independent look at this," Jeff said. Calm. Measured. Mark didn't answer. The next few minutes felt like slow motion. Mom got up and walked toward the kitchen, as if putting distance between herself and the truth might soften it. Dad stayed seated, his eyes now on me. Not in anger, in something closer to apology. "I didn't want this to be how you found out," I said to both of them. Mark's voice cracked. "You're twisting everything." "No," I said. "I'm not saying anything that isn't already written down." He looked at the papers again, each one now a nail in the story he built. And then, for the first time, he had nothing to say. He sat back in the chair across from me, arms folded. Not in confidence, defense. I didn't press further. I stood up, took a breath, and looked at both of my parents. I didn't come to hurt anyone. I just couldn't stay quiet anymore. They didn't answer, but they didn't look away either. And for the first time in days, I didn't feel like I was on the outside of my own family. Mark tried once more, just a whisper. "You think you've won?" I shook my head. "This isn't about winning." And then quiet again. But it wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was necessary. The kind of quiet that follows after something heavy has finally fallen. What happened next wasn't justice. It was something quieter and harder. What happened next wasn't justice. It was something quieter and harder. We sat in that stillness for a long time. The weight of what had just happened didn't explode. It settled, like fine dust after a storm. Everyone moved slower, softer. Like we were walking through the ruins of something none of us could yet name. Justice ends a fight. Healing asks a different question. By late morning, Jeff had gone. He gave me a nod before leaving, the kind men give when they don't have words but understand everything. I saw him glance once at Mark. No hatred, just a clear awareness that whatever trust had once existed there, it wasn't coming back. Mark didn't say much. He hovered near the hallway for a while, maybe waiting for someone to call him back into the center of the conversation. No one did. Eventually, he disappeared into the back room, and no one asked where he went. The house was quieter now, the kind of quiet that wasn't threatening anymore. I could hear the wind outside, a neighbor's lawn mower in the distance, the occasional thump of branches tapping against the windows. Ordinary sounds. Peaceful, almost. I stayed in the living room while Mom and Dad moved slowly around the kitchen. Not quite speaking, but not avoiding me either. We all needed air, space, silence. Mark's consequences started quietly. A phone call from the estate attorney, professional, direct. "Certain documents will need to be reviewed independently," he said. I agreed, thanked him, and let him speak uninterrupted. It wasn't about punishing Mark. I didn't need revenge. Accountability, yes, but I wasn't there to humiliate anyone. I didn't respond to the messages from cousins Mark had contacted before. Those who'd called me paranoid or said I was stirring up drama. They'd gone silent now. Maybe ashamed, maybe confused. That part didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what came next, and how we got there without tearing the rest of this family apart. Midday sun was warming up the house by the time Mom walked over and sat beside me on the couch. She didn't look like someone ready to talk. She looked like someone who'd finally put down a heavy bag she'd carried too long. "I didn't know what to do," she said, barely above a whisper. "He said it was just helping, that we didn't need to worry." I nodded. "I know. I didn't think. I never thought it would become this." Her eyes didn't hold defensiveness or denial, just grief, and something that looked like relief. Dad joined a few minutes later. He didn't sit right away. He just stood near the window, arms crossed, eyes steady. "We made it too easy," he said flatly. He didn't steal anything. Not the way people mean that word. But he took control. Quietly, bit by bit. I didn't say he was right or wrong. I just listened. I didn't want to look weak, Dad added. That's the part that gets me. Being manipulated doesn't make you weak, I said. Not seeing it doesn't make you guilty. They both fell silent again. I'm not here to fix everything, I continued. I just wanted us to stop pretending like none of it was happening. And they heard me. For the first time, really heard me. Not as a son who came back too late or a problem to be managed. Just as someone who still cared. Later that afternoon, I stepped out to the porch. The chair that had once sat facing the garden, where Dad would avoid eye contact and drift off while Mark ran things inside, was now turned back toward the door, facing in, like it was waiting for something or someone. Dad came out a few minutes after me. He didn't say anything, just walked past, took a seat in that chair, and rested his hands on his knees. He didn't hesitate. He didn't avoid. That was all I needed. We didn't talk. The wind moved through the trees above us, and for the first time it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like exhale. Inside, Mom was humming softly while washing dishes. The kind of hum you don't notice unless you're paying attention. The kind of sound that says, we're okay. Not fixed, but okay. And me? I wasn't thinking about staying or leaving or rescuing anyone anymore. I wasn't trying to prove anything or make anyone see what they didn't want to. I knew now where my line was. I'd be present, yes, but not in charge. I'd help, but I wouldn't rescue. I'd watch, but I wouldn't absorb every blow. I didn't come back to control. I came back to stand where I should have stood years ago, beside them, not above or behind. This family, like so many others, would never be picture perfect. But that was never the point. The point was showing up. With clarity. With truth. Without pretending. I sat on the edge of the porch, feeling the grain of old wood under my palms. Some families heal by talking. Ours healed the moment we stopped pretending. Thank you for staying until the end. Some stories are hard to tell, but you're always welcome here.